Hello everyone, welcome back. This is part 3, Units of History, Warships of the Carthaginian, I can't even pronounce it right now, Carthaginian Navy documentary.
Faced little opposition at sea and was instead used to transport land forces for a series of pitched battles which culminated in the siege of Himera. Here, the Punic fleet was drawn ashore in a fortified coastal camp. The Greeks correctly identified this as the greatest threat and infiltrated the position for a surprise attack whilst a pitched battle was underway. In the ensuing chaos, many ships would be destroyed, making the eventual defeat and retreat of the Punic army all the more deadly. As had occurred during their initial advances, the survivors would be battered on the way home by another storm. Such were the vicissitudes of the Sicilian campaigns. There would be 8 more of these Punic wars in Sicily, with increasing levels of military investment and resulting ferocity. We will not have time to cover them all in detail, but can give you a taste. Generally speaking, we see the Carthaginians deploying fleets in the hundreds, with each wave boasting greater proportions of new ships such as triremes, quadriremes, and eventually the hulking quinquiremes. These were often used for large-scale operations like invasions, blockades, and pitched battles. Yet they could also be used more flexibly for smaller operations like raids and lightning strikes. The Third Sicilian War against Dionysius of Syracuse provides an excellent case study. In the initial phases, the Carthaginians had but a fleet of 100 to delay the advances of the tyrant's force of 200 warships and 80,000 infantry. Soon, however, Punic reinforcements arrived, bringing their total to 300 warships and 50,000 infantry. Under the commander Himilco, this force was deftly used to outplay Dionysius. For instance, a landing at Cape Polorum drew out the Greek army from Messene, at which point a detachment of the Carthaginian fleet filled with picked rowers and marines quickly sailed around their rear to seize and sack the city. Soon after, the two sides would clash at sea in 397 BC at the Battle of Catana. Here, Himilco fielded some 200 triremes and 300 transports retrofitted with rams, while Dionysius deployed a mix of 180 triremes and the new quinquiremes. According to Diodorus Siculus, the naval battle began in the Greeks' favour when their admiral led a sudden sally of an elite force. However, he was ultimately driven to flight, leaving the rest of his fleet leaderless and disorganized in the face of the ensuing Carthaginian counterattack. Though the Greek quinquiremes were larger and far better manned than the Punic triremes, the smaller ships were able to lock them down with grapples and shoot, swarm, or ram them into oblivion. When the battle was finished and the Syracusan fleet crushed, the Carthaginians showed no mercy, sweeping along the coasts to kill any Greeks attempting to swim back to shore. Accordingly, the coasts of Sicily became choked with the corpses and broken timbers of the defeated navy. After the Third Sicilian War, the Carthaginians fought 2 more wars against Dionysius, and in these, the Carthaginian fleet proved invaluable. For instance, the capture of the Syracusan fleet at Eryx and the death of the Greek tyrant led directly to the end of the Fifth Sicilian War. In the next 2 Sicilian wars, the Punic navy continued to show its strength and versatility, with the fleet breaking into small squadrons of 20 to 50 ships, which brutally raided coastal cities and wreaked havoc on enemy shipping. By the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginian navy had justifiably attained a formidable reputation. When Pyrrhus of Epirus launched his invasion in 280 BC, Carthage would actually pledge 120 of its ships to support the Romans. When Pyrrhus turned on Sicily next, it was the Punic fleet which would help resist his advances, and eventually dealt him a punishing defeat upon his retreat back to Italy. But the ultimate withdrawal of this external force would leave Carthage and Rome on a collision course. The First Punic War, which kicked off in 264 BC, would primarily take place in Sicily between two asymmetric powers, the Romans excelling on land and the Carthaginians excelling at sea. Initially, this made for a rather inconclusive affair, as legionary advances across Sicily were stalled by a Punic blockade of the island, which choked their supply lines and allowed them to raid coastal Italy with near impunity. Eventually, the Senate would seek to break the impasse by raising their own navy, largely using allied Greek expertise, and reportedly by copying the design of a wrecked Punic quinquereme. In the ensuing battles along the coasts of Sicily, the Carthaginians were initially able to maintain the upper hand. However, the invention of the corvus changed the nature of combat. It was a spiked boarding bridge, capable of being lifted, swiveled, and dropped on enemy vessels. This device made it far more difficult for Punic ships to use their superior maneuverability to evade the clutches of the Roman vessels, and essentially allowed the legions to transform naval combat into a land battle. With the playing field leveled, the Romans began to turn the tides and even planned a naval invasion of Africa in 256 BC. This would be contested by the Carthaginians at the enormous Battle of Egnomus, which featured almost 700 ships and 250,000 participants. It was here that the Carthaginians split their fleet in three to attempt to draw apart and envelop the compact Roman formation.
Yep.
The assaults on the wings were successful until a victorious Roman center was able to rally and relieve their beleaguered comrades, winning the battle. Over the course of the war, the Carthaginians fought back and were greatly assisted by a series of storms, which the inferior Roman sailors, weighed down by their corvae, were poorly equipped to deal with. Hundreds of ships would be lost, along with many tens of thousands of lives. Yet, the stubbornness of the Senate meant that absurd amounts of money and bodies would be thrown into the conflict to rebuild after every loss and keep the war machine churning. The Carthaginians, by contrast, were unwilling or unable to devote the same levels of effort, and by the end of the war struggled to fully staff their navy. Yet they nonetheless put up a valiant effort, winning victories at the Battle of Drepana and Phintius, while proving their superiority in smaller scale action like blockade running and raiding. It seems that by this time they had learned to better counter the corvus, which was simultaneously seeing less use owing to its associated risk during storms. In 241 BC, a final climactic battle would be fought between both fleets at the Agates Islands. Here, the Carthaginians deployed 200 quinqueremes against the 250 of the Romans. The battle did not feature much in the way of noteworthy tactics and appears to have been a straightforward brawl. While the corvus was not used, it seems that the Romans were more capable in traditional naval tactics than when they had started the war, and, because they had stripped their ships for speed prior to battle, were said to now be able to get the upper hand against the understaffed and overburdened Carthaginian warships. Nonetheless, it was a bloody fight, with heavy losses on both sides. Ultimately, the Romans emerged victorious. By this point, a thoroughly exhausted Carthage was ready to come to the peace table. The ensuing treaty would see them abandon Sicily and agree to massive payments over 10 years. This would prove to be the end of Carthaginian naval supremacy, yet their fight with Rome was far from over. While they never again took to the seas in the same numbers, the Carthaginians were quick to get their naval capabilities back online. For instance, it is believed that the Great Kothon Harbour was built around this time. The exterior harbour was likely its ancient port, which would be reserved for commercial use, while the new interior harbour would be dedicated to military use. It was surrounded by a double wall, inside of which lay dozens of ship sheds, capable of housing between 150 and 220 ships. Each ship shed was propped up by Ionic columns, giving the impression that the harbour was a grand portico, concealing the weapons of war that lurked within. In the middle of the Kothon, the Carthaginians built an island on which the Admiral's Tower was located, which oversaw both the facilities and the sea itself. From here, the Admiral could direct all kinds of naval matters at Carthage, sending out fleets for offense or drawing a great chain across the entrance for defense. Over the course of the Second Punic War, the harbour would be the origin from which Carthage's military might was once again projected. While few pitched battles at sea occurred, fleets nonetheless helped supply and reinforce armies across many theatres of war. However, Roman victory at the Battle of Zama ultimately forced the surrender of Carthage with the punishing terms of peace, putting an end to Carthage's maritime empire. Nonetheless, Punic sailors once more returned to the seas to enrich themselves through trade. This prompted Rome to finally put an end to any dreams of an eventual return, with Cato ending every speech before the Senate with the admonition, "Carthage must be destroyed." The Third Punic War was finally waged to put the great city under siege. This was another brutal affair, which saw the remnants of the Punic fleet bravely partaking in sallies, raids, and blockade running. Ultimately, however, it was their home, the Kothon Harbour, which would become the focus of Roman assaults and the breach through which the city was stormed. Yet, while this would be the end of the Carthaginian navy, its legacy and even its sailors would fight on under the new management of the Romans. I hope you've appreciated this deep dive.
This is really interesting. I'm glad I did this one. Yeah, so the Carthaginian navy was the awesome, the best, the greatest at, for what they did. And then the Romans just decided, all right, we got to get our shit together, and came up with a way to beat them. It was interesting. Well, I'm going to end this video here. Appreciate the watch. Like and subscribe. Throw a baby off a cliff. I don't know.